Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. Firstly, a big thank you to all of those of you that have been in touch. And for those of you that are downloading the show on a regular basis, I do hope that you're enjoying it and enjoying listening to quite a diversity of guests that we're getting on now. I was going to ask if people could spread the word, really. If you know someone else that may be interested in the show, maybe you're a teacher and you could pass this on to students, or if you're a student yourself and you could pass it on to other people that may be interested. Basically, I'm trying to get my listeners up. The more people that listen and the better the reviews, the more of these that I can make. And in particular, those of you that download via Apple, if you could give me a review, a good review, 5 stars would be nice, that would be really beneficial to help me keep on making as many of these as possible. And so my guest for this episode was Professor Fergus McNeill, a lecturer in Criminology at the University of Glasgow. And I spoke to Fergus about all things to do with crime, actually, and many of his ideas came from his book, Pervasive Punishment, Making Sense of Mass Supervision. And we talked not only just about why perhaps some people fall into crime, but more importantly, how he believes that society and societies should deal with criminality. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, so my name is Fergus McNeill. I am Professor of Criminology and Social Work at the University of Glasgow.
Great, thank you, Fergus. And what was your route into what you're doing now? I know you worked in social work and a few other things before getting to where you are at the moment.
Yeah, it's quite a long and winding road. So I started out as an undergraduate studying history and philosophy, and although I enjoyed that, by the time I got to the end of it, I wanted to do something practical. So I volunteered originally in a residential drug rehab for a kind of gap year experience, and just found it a remarkable place to be. So I stayed in the end for 3 years, and at the end of that time came back up to Glasgow and did my master's in social work. That would have been my first introduction to sociology, actually, within the master's in social work course. And then I qualified as a social worker and immediately moved into practice in the criminal justice system. And in the Scottish context, we don't have probation or parole officers. We have criminal justice social workers who are part of local authorities. It's quite an unusual setup here. So I did that job for 5 years in the East End of Glasgow in neighbourhoods that had very high rates of poverty, on the harsh end of social inequality, and with very high rates of imprisonment. And then in '98, I went back to the university to teach social work, and specifically to teach the criminal justice components of courses for qualifying social workers. And since then, since '98, I've for a variety of reasons, drifted more towards criminology and sociology of punishment, and now find myself in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at Glasgow, which is also connected with the sociology subject area here. Great.
Quite a long winding road, as you said, to get to where you are. And within sociology or criminology, for that matter, is there any particular theorists or studies that really kind of inspired you? What were you reading when you were studying yourself before getting to the teaching part?
Yeah, I mean, I started out with textbooks when training to be a social worker. So there was a great book called Sociology for Social Workers by Vivian Cree, who was at the University of Edinburgh, and Criminology for Social Workers by David Smith from the University of Lancaster. And they were brilliant short introductions to those disciplines as they related to the practice of social work. And they were kind of key conduits into the literature that lay behind those texts. I guess as I moved on, particularly when I was studying my second master's degree which was a kind of advanced criminology for social workers master's, I got into the sociology of punishment at that time. I was reading David Garland, a countryman of mine, who still has a link to Edinburgh University. And through Garland, accessing Marx, Foucault, Durkheim, and actually, in my own PhD, I kind of drifted towards Bourdieu because his concepts and tools helped me think about how my profession was being shaped and reshaped by a range of social and cultural forces in the 1990s and early 2000s. But yeah, there's been a huge number of theorists. Bauman's been very influential in helping me think about how certain social groups are othered and marginalized. And I guess I have an interest in practices of misrecognition and symbolic violence, which draws on Bourdieu, but also relates to Bauman. And in the more sort of, in theories that are trying to be more constructive or progressive or look to actually suggest how things could change and should change, recently I've been reading Nancy Fraser and Jean Tronto, both very relevant to current projects that I'm involved with.
It's interesting that you mentioned even sort of classic studies. They're still relevant to criminality today, is that right?
Actually, I would say particularly to the understanding of punishment and how punishment evolves. So, as with a lot of sociology, the influence of sort of core thinkers like Marx, Durkheim, and Foucault is enduring, but the more that the discipline or the sub-discipline matures and evolves, the more expansive the range of theories and theorists becomes, and we get more sophisticated accounts. What I like about David Garland's work is that he describes it as conjunctural, meaning we can't look at one set of social or cultural forces in isolation from another. I guess a bit like Bourdieu, it's about the relations between things, between political systems, electoral politics, the way the economy is structured, the kind of the long-standing influence of cultural traditions that shape the way in which particular countries view and practice punishment. So yeah, I'm still fascinated by all of those questions, but always finding new and fresh theorists to help us kind of get better at teasing apart these dynamics.
Thanks, Fergus. And what I thought would be really good to talk about today was kind of two parts. Firstly, what you think kind of causes crime, or many of the factors that cause crime in the first place, and in the second part, how we actually deal with criminality. So, from your own research and obviously work as a social worker as well, I know it's a huge question, but what do you think are the most common reasons that lead an individual into criminality?
Well, actually, it's interesting the way that you frame the question, because that already implies a certain kind of bias towards perceiving the individual who has offended as having some specific set of needs or worse, deficiencies or a pathology that lies behind a behaviour which is considered abnormal. And of course, one of the things that sociological criminology has done over many decades is expose the myth of thinking about crime in that way. So whether it's the kind of basic proposition that we need to understand criminalization as a social process, which reflects social inequalities in a variety of ways, or whether it's the recognition that there are profound environmental and structural influences upon people's life chances and opportunities that produce, in the classic Mertonian sense, innovations and adaptations.
Yeah.
That's strain theory, obviously. For me, one of the fundamental contributions of sociological criminology is to push us away from thinking about pathologies and thinking about drivers within individuals or propensities. Criminologists still study those propensities, and there's still merit in that work. to varying degrees depending on its type and form and focus. But yeah, for me, the things I am interested in are more to do with the enduring and traumatizing effects of criminalization, and how the wrong practices, institutions and cultures of punishment become iatrogenic. They produce social harms that we then have to find other ways to mop up, or just we suffer the consequences of the harms that we do through punishment, rather than addressing the social and structural problems that lie behind both crime and uneven criminalization.
Because one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is identity. You know, I know you talk quite a lot about that. Could you just explain that a little bit more detail? Why is identity so fundamental to understanding crime and criminality?
Well, you could take that again on many levels. So in my own work on desistance from crime, so that's the process. That's where criminologists study the process by which people cease to offend, how they manage to move beyond an established pattern of behaviour and essentially find a way to change their lives in ways that are constructive for them and better for society, arguably better for society. Identity transition is often discussed in that literature, and it's about how a person who has been persistently labelled in a certain way as a result of their behaviour, but also as a result of the way that their behaviour has been responded to by police, by courts, by society more broadly, how that person manages somehow to retain a positive sense of self, or to develop a positive sense of self, and to shed the label criminal. That label carries enormous weight and imposes enormous burdens on people. Materially, it's associated with profound socioeconomic disadvantage, with limited social mobility, but symbolically it also freights a person with negative expectations, with distrust, with fear. And whether we look at the labour market and the struggle to participate in the labour market for people with convictions, or whether we look at the way individuals are treated within communities, within the media, in public and political discourse more generally, a person who's trying to shed that identity is kind of swimming against a very powerful tide. So some of my practical work, or activist work, if you like, has been around trying to find ways to challenge labelling and stigmatizing processes, and to this picking up on the Bauman influence, where he talks about adiaphorization, the process by which we other people or we estrange people. And some of the work that I'm doing currently in a project called Distant Voices, for example, that project uses songwriting and song sharing in and around criminal justice to try and enhance the quality of public dialogue about crime punishment and reintegration. And one of its fundamental contributions is to make it more difficult to estrange people, to defamiliarize them, to regard them as other, different, or lesser in particular. And it does that by allowing the music to communicate fundamental aspects of human experience to which we can relate. So it helps us find similitude and proximity to people who are in different situations, which I hope acts as a kind of, at least some sort of counterbalance to those wider social forces of demonization and marginalization.
Yeah, it just made me think of kind of either Becker's work and the master status, or Edwin Lemur and primary and secondary deviance. Once that label is attached to someone, or their self-perception, that becomes so difficult to shake, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, so actually Lemur has been used by desistance theorists, colleagues of mine. Shad Maruna and Steve Farrell came up with the idea of primary and secondary desistance. So it's just the inversion of Lemur. Yeah. So primary desistance is not offending, it's a behavioural thing, but secondary resistance is shedding the label. And I added to that formulation the idea of tertiary resistance. So the third level is, if I have stopped behaving in a certain way and I have shed or tried to get beyond the identity associated with the behaviour, or the criminalisation of the behaviour in this case, that's all very well, but I need a receptive audience for my identity change. So if you don't accept that I am, in inverted commas, reformed, or that I am now a good citizen or a person of good standing in a community, then the fact that my personal identity has gone through some change isn't going to produce the social effects that I need in order to secure my integration, or my position in a community, or my ability to find solidarity with other people. Mm. So I think that primary, secondary, tertiary idea is a useful one for helping us think about how the behaviour, identity and belonging is how I think about primary, secondary, tertiary.
Yeah.
And behaviour, identity and belonging are all profoundly interrelated. And absent the production of belonging and social solidarity, then the ties that bind us are going to be weak. And when those ties are weak, compliance with the norms of the social group are also weak. And that creates a society which is more atomized, more individualistic, more combative, more violent in certain respects, and more dangerous for people to dwell in. So finding resources for solidarity becomes, I think, very important in helping people escape not just offending, but actually escape criminal justice. I don't mean escape justice. I mean escape the clutches of a system that traps them and that prevents their development and their securing of a better social position.
Yeah. So even kind of Durkheim's work on belonging, solidarity, consensus, that's as relevant today as it ever was.
It is. I did some work on Durkheim with my colleague at Glasgow, Matt Dawson, a while ago, in trying to make sense of the development of probation systems, and we kind of theorized that those systems, the idea that a relationship between a supervisor and a supervised person might be a kind of architecture, a sort of relational architecture that allowed the development of the sort of restitutive or reparative forms of response to crime that Durkheim hoped were going to succeed the prison. When he was writing about penal evolution, and of course he was in that essay and in his work more generally a bit depressed that there hadn't been more progress towards restitutive forms of punishment that would be more consistent with the mission of justice that he saw as part of organic solidarity. So yeah, absolutely. I would still hold to the fact that we need to find ways of responding to conflict and harm that build solidarity rather than undermining it. And my problem with much of what we do in the name of justice, criminal justice today, as illustrated by current events in America, obviously, is that the repressive, punitive violence of the state in response to perceived wrongdoing by certain social actors tears at the social fabric and produces civil conflict between individuals and groups. And yeah, America today is an ugly and vivid illustration of the wrong strategy, the wrong practice, callous disregard for people, tearing away at what holds a nation state together.
And I was just thinking, actually, kind of flipping that argument on its head then, which societies have kind of got it right? I mean, no one's got it perfect, but is there an opposite to that?
This is the point in this conversation where criminologists always start talking about Scandinavia.
Yes, yeah.
And that it's difficult to avoid that on one level, because if you look at the expansive welfare states, relatively low rates of imprisonment, relatively short prison sentences, relatively better prison conditions and regimes, then there's a lot to commend those countries. But if you speak to criminologists, critical criminologists or sociologists of punishment from those countries, they will surface a whole range of problems that should make us cautious about eulogizing what happens over there. So, for example, Vanessa Barker has done terrific work. She's an American, but living in Sweden, and her recent book is on Nordic nationalism and penal order, and it's about how the development of neoliberalism in Sweden in response to the so-called refugee crisis means that even a paragon of liberal, progressive social democracy can turn and can turn out to be profoundly punitive and exclusionary, particularly to people who are not treated or regarded as being really of the nation.
Yeah.
And similar criticisms are made in relation to Norway. Norway's famous for the quality of its prison regimes and the quality of its correctional system. But if you look at the treatment of people in refugee and immigration detention in the Nordic countries, you get a different picture. And some argue that the price of a relatively lenient and progressive penal system is cultural homogeneity. So if you're an ethnic Norwegian, whatever that means, and you're identified as a citizen of that state, then you might expect a certain form of treatment. But if you don't count fully as a Norwegian in Norway, then you shouldn't expect that you'll get the same treatment. So there's a dark side even to the best states. And I think another way of looking at it, rather than looking at country comparisons, valid and valuable though those are, is to compare practices at the local level. So, you could look to prison abolition movements and look to communities of people of color in America where complete distrust in the police, for obvious reasons, requires the development of what some call transformative justice. So grassroots modes of conflict resolution and mediation that avoid the formal criminal justice system altogether because it can't be trusted with people of color. That's the view of people in those movements. So, all over the world, you can find grassroots practices and communities that are trying to find their own ways of responding to crime problems without recourse to the formal justice system. And I think there's a lot of value and merit in studying the lessons from those movements.
Great. Thank you, Fergus. That's going to be the end of part one. And in part two, we're going to talk more about the punishment side of criminality. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Fergus McNeill. Fergus, I wanted to talk to you about punishment in a bit more detail now. So firstly, what does your research show in terms of which forms of punishment are perhaps not effective or less effective, should we say?
Yeah, I mean, in broad terms, the more punitive our responses to crime, the less effective. Although a lot depends on what you mean by effective. That's a big word that conceals a lot of assumptions and also a lot of values. So, a strict retributivist would argue that in order to be effective, all a punishment has to be as painful, and it's just a question of balance. If you're interested in reducing crime through punishment or through criminal justice responses, then that's a different philosophy, a more utilitarian approach, and it begs certain questions about evidence. So, if your question is about what kinds of criminal justice responses produce safer societies, then I would argue that the weight of the evidence is that less repressive and less punitive responses produce better effects. The reasons are kind of blindingly obvious once you start thinking about it. If we react punitively to offences in such a way that we impose harms on people, then we produce disability, if you like, a kind of social disability or an incapacity. We talk about incapacitation as a justification for imprisonment, but imprisonment doesn't just incapacitate while people are detained. It produces, for some people, lifelong incapacitating effects. It diminishes their abilities to live well in the community. And it does that through a set of mechanisms, some of which are psychological, to do with how people adapt to prison and become institutionalized. Some of them, though, are back to the questions of stigma, labeling, and marginalization that we discussed earlier. So punishment turns out to be criminogenic in those circumstances. If you harm people in such a way that you weaken their capacity to live well, then you kind of push them towards living badly. And that has adverse consequences for all of us. Now, again, my career began in social work, and my principal focus as a social worker was rehabilitation. But that's also a really messy concept. So in my own work, I talk about 4 different aspects or 4 different forms of rehabilitation. One of those is about individual change, about a person developing the capacities and skills and the motivation that they need to live a better life. Another, though, is about their legal position. And to be legally rehabilitated is to be restored and requalified in your rights as a citizen. A third is related to your moral rehabilitation, which is about a kind of dialogical process whereby offenders, victims, and communities negotiate the settlement of a debt, if you like, a notional debt that a crime creates or represents. And the fourth is social rehabilitation, which is linked to the questions of solidarity and integration that I mentioned in the first half.
Yeah.
And I argue that in Western criminal justice systems, we're so obsessed with individual rehabilitation, sometimes called correctional rehabilitation, sometimes called psychological rehabilitation, that we invest resources in some systems in cognitive behavioral interventions, in casework, in programs that try to fix what we perceive to be wrong with the inverted commas offender.
Yeah.
And we leave all the rest. We leave the legal disqualification, the social marginalization, and the moral conflict unresolved. And then we chuck people out prisons at the end in a disqualified, marginalized position. You know, in some states, people released from prison can't vote. They're barred from public assistance. They're barred from public housing. That's not the case in the UK, but we have other forms of marginalisation and exclusion that we impose on former prisoners, who often tell us that the second sentence, the one they serve after release, is the hardest, or the harder. Yeah, I think essentially the short answer to your question is that the more punitively we respond to crime, the more crime we create. And the more that we try to generate responses which connect people. I think of crime, conflict, and social harm as being relational at core. We're talking about the damage that is done to relationships by certain behaviours. And you can't remedy relationships by working on individuals. You have to repair relationships, and that's best done through approaches that are directly aimed at relational repair, at restoration, at transformation of social relationships and social contexts. So those are the kinds of approaches I would be looking at. One last comment, which I think is really important. In the current project I mentioned earlier, Distant Voices, I'm working with a political scientist called Oliver Escobar, who's an expert in participatory and deliberative forms of democracy, and more generally on political communication. And he talks about dialogue. Dialogue is a key aspect of his work, which he contrasts with debate. And debate comes from the Latin debare, which means to beat down. So a debate, literally in the Latin, is a fight, a kind of verbal fight, an argument. Think of it like a dialectic. There's a thesis against an antithesis. We might get a synthesis, or we might just have one win. And that's the way political discourse tends to go in this country. But dialogue comes from logos. So it's a flow of meaning between people. And rehabilitation can be monological or dialogical. And in the kind of programs that I have a problem with, sometimes it's monological, it's didactic. We will teach you how to behave. We will teach you why you are wrong, and we will fix you. And I think that's deeply problematic morally, politically, socially, and that what we need in response to crime, conflict, and harm is dialogue between the affected parties. So for me, a rehabilitative process is a rehabilitative process that has any chance of working has to be dialogical. It has to invite people into a conversation about right and wrong, about fairness and unfairness, about what binds us together and what tears us apart, about social solidarity and the terms and conditions under which we find it and lose it. So those are sociological conversations, but they're also philosophical and political conversations that we should be trying to have when we're trying to address these kinds of social problems.
And so I'm just thinking, so is the main hurdle to that purely financial, having the people to be able to do that, have the time and the money to be able to focus on that? And I'm just thinking, is it easier just to throw away someone in a prison cell? Is that the reason it happens?
Well, it can't be financial because we spend a fortune on prisons.
Yeah.
And we sustain that level of spending in a way which other European countries and other countries which are culturally somewhat proximate to us, like Ireland or Norway, don't. Like the imprisonment rates in those countries are about half ours. So they're spending a lot less on prisons, and they're spending a lot more in the Norwegian case on welfare. So I would think if we can get the money out of our prison system and into communities, then it's not so difficult to imagine expending resources in community development in order to create the kind of dialogical forums within which community problems can be addressed. But communities need resources to resolve those problems, material resources, not just talking shops. And so that's why to me it's critical to get the money out of the penal system where it cannot be spent productively. Like the prison system, if you think about it, is a way of burning money, right? We throw a lot of money at a system which weakens the capacity of people to live well. It's almost the least productive imaginable response. It's like we've got a health problem, so we'll put people in a hospital where we'll apply treatments that make them worse.
Yeah.
And then we'll release them back into the community. It's like it literally is a way of burning social resources and human capital, because of the damage that we're doing to people through that system. So we just have to get the money and the human capital out of those systems and into the communities where the problems exist and need to be addressed.
So is there any evidence that any form of incarceration, even for a short period, is effective in any way at all?
That's a really tricky question. I mean, there are lots of ways that criminologists study that question, and you can do it using clever statistical techniques like propensity score matching, where you take people who have similar attributes, who've committed similar crimes, and they've been put through different justice responses. If you do that, you generally find, and this is painting with a very broad brush, so there's a kind of health warning with this summary, but you broadly find that imprisonment is mildly criminogenic, so it's slightly worse.
Yeah.
All other things being equal, or as equal as we can make them with these methodologies, it's slightly worse than community sentences, for example. Longer prison sentences have somewhat lower reconviction rates, but it would be a mistake to regard that as an effect of imprisonment. It's not that something good happens in the prison that enables the person to change. It's that the person comes out older, right? And crime is mostly a young person's, or at least the crimes that we criminalize are mostly young people's activities. So, on the other hand, for balance, it has to be said that there are plenty of prisoner memoirs and autobiographies that talk about transformative experiences in prison. So prison can be transformative for some people, but my kind of, again, summarizing a very complicated body of evidence here, my view would be that that's in spite of imprisonment rather than because of it, and that it'd be much better to create the conditions that enable positive human development in the community. And apart from anything else, even people who experience profound transformation in prison face the challenge of taking that change from one environment and making it real in another. And I remember when I was a social work student, actually, they talked continuously about transfer of learning. So we'll teach you in the classroom, you'll take it to the placement where you'll apply it. And it was a massive challenge to transfer learning from a classroom to a social work placement. It's a much bigger challenge to transfer learning about personal transformation in a prison to life after, when all of the social barriers that we've been discussing already are applied. So yeah, better to support transformation outside the prison if transformation is what's required.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, how would that look? I mean, we've talked about, individual change. How does social rehabilitation work, or what does your evidence suggest is the most effective measure for that?
Well, that's the focus of the Distant Voices project. So that's the one with Oliver Escobar, who's a political scientist, but also Joel Collinson-Scott, who's a musicologist and a songwriter, an artist, and with Alison Urie, who is the community development practitioner that leads a third sector organisation called Vox Liminis, Voices from the Threshold, which we set up together a few years ago to try to bring creative practices to criminal justice and to its transformation, hopefully. And Distant Voices is a specific project of Vox Liminis with the universities involved to try to explore crime punishment and reintegration. And to put it, to give you a very kind of crude summary of a very complicated 4-year project, what we've discovered, or what I think we've discovered, I shouldn't speak for the whole team because we're still analysing data, but what I think we've discovered is that criminal justice simplifies, distorts, and flattens people and conflicts. And it does it through the imposition of a set of binaries: offender, victim, guilty, innocent, responsible, not responsible. And then it takes that flattened person or conflict and it further processes it through the penal system in ways which marginalize, other, estrange, distance those individuals subject to those sanctions. So those are the problems that we create in the way that we respond to crime through the justice system. We've been looking at songwriting and community building as practices that it turns out, I think, address some of those dynamics or reverse or at least counteract some of those dynamics. So when you engage in collaborative creative processes with somebody, there's a instead of flattening, you're substantiating. Instead of estranging, you're making familiar or coming closer to. Instead of marginalizing, you're becoming proximate. Instead of distorting, you're seeing one another with the clarity that comes from the collaborative exchanges. So we've written about this in a paper in a recent issue of the Journal of Extreme Anthropology, which is an online journal where we look at hospitality, hostility, and reintegration, and explore how in a songwriting, through the process of collaborative songwriting, you can see what's going on that prefigures a set of practices, perhaps, that suggest how we might respond more constructively and creatively to offending. And we've also studied, not within the project, but kind of as an adjunct, we've looked at restorative justice practices, where there's a kind of carefully mediated process of dialogue between victims and offenders and community members to confront the impact of a crime, but also to try to negotiate through dialogue a way of responding to that constructively and reparatively. And we see again similarities between those practices and what we've seen through songwriting, collaborative songwriting, and through the building of a community around those practices, which is also part of our project. So I think the common theme across collaborative songwriting, community building, and restorative justice is dialogue and recognition. So these are processes of dialogue, dialogical processes that recognize the parties and that allow them to be seen, to be heard, and that also require them to listen carefully and to see others. And so we're currently kind of exploring what our data is telling us about precisely why and how that seems to work, and what we might take from it for wider conversations about change.
Well, what I was thinking is, let's say that something like a form of community or an area for people to go to engage in music or whatever it may be, that they should be there in the first place rather than a form of rehabilitation after criminality.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were investing adequately in communities, in education, in practices and processes that allowed people to develop their creativity, both for reasons of self-expression, self-exploration, and for reasons to do with connection, community, and relationship, then we would be much better resourced to manage conflicts in different ways, which don't require the authority of the state to intervene coercively, which is what criminal justice is. It's coercion in order to respond to a perceived social harm. So, if we could bring that resource to communities to develop people's creativity, to build connection, to establish relationships, to mediate conflicts, then we wouldn't need the size and power of a formal criminal justice system as a response to so much offending, which, well, to me, the response is often disproportionate to the wrongs, and the harms that come from the response outweigh the harms that are done by the crime. So we kind of multiply the harms instead of addressing the wrongs.
So if all the evidence is pointing in that direction, what is the reluctance to change the system?
Well, because the system isn't built on evidence, obviously. And that's where the sociology of punishment comes in and helps us understand what to use an old-fashioned phrase, what the latent functions of punishment are in a neoliberal society or under a capitalist economy, or pick your bogeyman if you like, or describe them using your own preferred terms. But for the key insight of the sociology of punishment is that penal systems are not to be understood simply as responses to crime or as ways of reducing crime. They are social institutions that need to be understood in their own right, and part of that is understanding what they do for society and for particular interests within society. So to give you one example, Loic Wacquant, the French sociologist based at Berkeley in California, writes in Punishing the Poor about how the state has two hands: the repressive right hand, I think it is, which is sort of masculinist and forceful, and that's the military, and it's the prison system, it's the police, and the left hand is the caring, nurturing, supposedly feminine hand of the welfare state. And as he describes it, under neoliberalism, the left hand is withdrawn and the right hand is forced in, and it functions to slap down and to keep disciplined, degraded, and controlled the populations on the receiving end of the social inequalities that neoliberalism creates, and on which it depends. So I can bring all the criminological evidence that you would like to
Mm.
the table in terms of what kind of system you would choose to create if you wanted a more constructive response to conflict and crime. But within the wider social context, we're not going to get that kind of system until we have much more fundamental changes in our society and economy. Doesn't mean we shouldn't struggle, though, and doesn't mean that we shouldn't be part of activist movements that are trying to change practices now. But that gets us into a whole other conversation about the line between reformist and abolitionist approaches. Maybe that's for another day.
Yeah, that's a big question. Thank you, Fergus. That's really, really fascinating, interesting stuff. Could you just tell us where people can learn more about your research? Any blogs, books, Twitter, anything like that?
Yeah, if people are interested in the desistance stuff, there's a blog called Discovering Desistance, which is archived now, so there's no more stuff going on it. But that came from a project a good few years ago and has a lot of content still of value. Pervasive Punishment is my more recent book, which is about making sense of mass supervision, the huge expansion of numbers of people subject to supervision in the community. There's also a blog, pervasivepunishment.com, associated with that book, also archived, but with content there that people could have a look at. And more generally, the website of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, where I'm based, is a good resource for all sorts of material. We also have a blog on that website, learning resources for schools, and yeah, all sorts of different material there. So that's just sccjr.ac.uk. When I forgot to mention Distant Voices Project, if people want to follow up on that, it's just distantvoices.org.uk for that one. And you can find on that website an enormous array of songs, videos, blog posts, all sorts of media engaging with questions mainly around reintegration.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Fergus. It's been fascinating insight.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.